Welcome to Talking Melons for 2020, a series of presentations that brings you a range of topics to assist in growing and marketing Australian melons. The presentations are available on the Melons Australia website as a video, a podcast, and as a slide deck. Visit www.melonsaustralia.org.au.
Hello, I'm Wayne Prowse from Fresh Intelligence, and today we're going to be looking at the global melon production and export trends. Through this presentation now, we're going to look at firstly the global fruit trade, and in particular where melons sit within that whole spectrum. And then we're going to look at the Australian production and export trends and put in context where our exports of melons are going within our total fruit exports and also within the context of global melon trade. So as I say, let's just first look at the world and where people live. Most people, no surprise, are living in the Northern Hemisphere and in Asia. 50% of the world's population live within about 5 hours of flying time from Hong Kong. And that takes in China and India. But 44% of the population live in the Northern Hemisphere, above the temperate zone. Within the tropic zone, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, 53% of the world's population live. And south of the Tropic of Capricorn, in the southern temperate zone, that's where we are. We're 3% of the world's population. That becomes significant as we go through this presentation because we're 3% of the world's population, and in many ways we're producing fruit at a particular time that it's in demand in the Northern Hemisphere where there are a lot more people. Also, consider this: the GDP, or gross domestic product, as a measure of purchasing power. The most lucrative markets are across the northern temperate zones, running across North America, Europe, and North Asia, which includes Japan, South Korea, and China, and particularly the east coast of China, which is developing rapidly. These are the areas that have a higher gross domestic product or purchasing power than many of the markets in the tropical zones. And of course, in the southern hemisphere, that's where we are. So let's just start with the very top level of global trade, and I can assure you that global trade is about $83 billion, and it's been growing at about 6.2% per year over the last 10 years. That equates to about 82 million tonnes. It's interesting to compare that the growth of fruit at 6.2% per year is higher than other food groups. For example, vegetables, which are 3.7% growth per year over the last 10 years. And between that fruit and vegetable growth, there is meat and seafood and grains and others, but they're all less growth than the fruit. So growth of fruit is higher. Also, we're looking at the growth of the fruit trade into those three major market areas, Europe, Asia, and the US. And you'll note that Europe is 5.1% growth per year over 10 years. North America is 6.1% growth, but Asia is 16.3% growth. So significantly more growth in that Asian market, driven by China and the free trade agreements and opening up and liberalising of trade in the Asian area is driving that growth, and that's good news for us because it's our closest market. Global fruit trade, as I mentioned earlier, is about 83 million tonnes. The largest of all fruit that's exported is bananas. Almost 25% of all fruit exported is bananas. That's coming out of tropical zones into the northern temperate zone. So almost all the bananas imported by Europe and the US and North Asia have to be imported from Central America or the Horn of Africa or Philippines, Southeast Asia. Melons come in about the fourth largest of all trade after apples and citrus. And then there's grapes there, so it's in the top 5. By value, bananas were 16.8 billion. They're up about 4% last year, followed by citrus on 14.6, berries, which is low volume but high value, 10.3 billion, apples, and then melons at $3.6 billion worth of trade, which is equivalent to about 7.6 million tonnes. That's both types of melons, of course, and that's the trade throughout Europe, through the whole world. I want to take a moment to just talk about the drivers of fresh fruit distribution. In that northern temperate zone that I talked about, the lucrative areas, temperate fruit, apples, citrus, grapes, summer fruit, cherries, those sorts of things, they're all grown in those areas, but they're only available for a certain period of time. So those products are distributed mainly within those areas where they're grown. And there's quite a bit of cross-border trade, of course. Then you have in the tropical fruit areas, and I'll put melons in there. I know melons aren't a tropical fruit per se, but they're grown a lot in tropical areas. And then you've got the bananas, the pineapples. They are all moved into the northern hemisphere, tropical zones, temperate zones, because they're not grown in those areas. So all the bananas, all the pineapples that are consumed in the northern temperate zones need to be imported from the tropic zones. When it comes to the southern hemisphere temperate zones, this is where it gets very interesting, particularly for us in Australia. Because remember, I said we're about 3% of the population. We are producing fruit, often that is not available in the northern temperate zone. So that demand is driving exports of our temperate fruits into the northern temperate zone, the northern hemisphere, at the opposite seasons to when they have it available up there. So that's a key driver of significant volumes. What you'll see is from Australia, from South Africa and South America, we're sending fruit into North America, into Europe, into Asia. We're obviously closest aligned to Asia. That's where obviously a lot of our fruit is going. But we are competing with South Africa and Chile, who are also sending fruit across into the Asian market, as well as their traditional North American and European markets. So it's no surprise that the biggest import markets are the United States, $15.4 billion out of that $82 billion I first mentioned. They're up 5%. China, $8.4 billion. They're up 27% growth in 1 year. A lot of that driven by cherries, for example, from the southern hemisphere, from more bananas coming in from Central America as well as the Philippines. Lots of things are driving China's demand for fruit that they don't produce themselves or don't have available year round, and the more lucrative consumers are wanting to buy fruit and this year round. The European markets, which would be larger overall if you put it all together, but there's a lot of trade within Europe, they're actually down, and part of the reason they're down is a number of factors to do with the production that spiked in 2018 and then fell away a little bit in 2019. The global exporters, no surprise once again, Spain is the largest exporter, $8.5 billion. This is of all fruit, and there's a big supplier up into the rest of Europe. Mexico is the second largest, and most of their fruit goes into the US. You have other players such as the Netherlands, which also import a lot and then redistribute. You've got the United States, which is a big exporter of their own fruit, but also a re-exporter of fruit from Mexico that then goes on to Canada. China is not as big an exporter as they are of an importer. They exported $4.4 billion worth, and most of that was apples. Surprisingly, In that top group is Chile, which is in the southern hemisphere, and they are sending an enormous amount of fruit now across to Asia as well as North America. And Ecuador is the biggest supplier of bananas into the United States and into Europe, and increasingly across into Asia. So that's just a very quick rundown of the global trade of fruit and the big drivers. Now we're going to have a look at melon production and trade specifically, which is close to the interest here. Melons, as I mentioned, are produced 131 million tonnes globally. They're actually, if I put all the citrus products together, they become the third largest fruit produced by volume after bananas and citrus. Then it's melons. They account for 15% of the global fruit production. When you look at where melons are produced, absolutely dominated by Asia. 89 million tonnes, or 68% of the global production of melons is from Asia, and 10% from the Middle East. That is mostly Turkey and Iran. Then the third is Europe, which is particularly the southern Europe, Spain, so forth, and Greece. North Africa, the big producers there, of course, would be Egypt. In South America, Brazil is the largest producer. In Central America, you have Honduras and a few other Central American markets. And Oceania, which includes us and New Zealand and predominantly us in Australia, is 0.2% of the global production. So we're doing 260,000 tonnes of the 131 million. Of the two types of melons, the watermelons is 103 million, and other melons, predominantly rock melons or cantaloupes, I know the number of different terminologies there, is 27 million tonnes. If we look at the graph, and I know for some you won't see the graph if just listening to voice only, of course, but you can see that there are two bands of production, north and south of the equator, and a large band of production in the north covers those areas of China and the Middle East, North Africa, Southern Europe, and Southern United States and the Central American countries. And that is by far and away the biggest area of production. The southern band, which includes us, from the most of Australia, of course, our 260,000 tonnes. A number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 1.2 million tonnes, and Brazil is 4.2 million tonnes, the biggest producer in South America. Global production has increased from about 90 million tonnes 20 years ago to 131 million tonnes now, and it's about 80% watermelon and 20% other melons. Melon trade is 7.6 million tonnes in 2019. That's approximately 5% of production globally. So that means that there's a lot of production is produced and consumed in the country where it is produced without crossing a border. The 7.6 million tonnes is cross-border trade, whether it's in Europe just crossing from Spain into France, or whether it's from Brazil going into Europe, or from Australia going into the Middle East. That's what we're talking about in terms of trade. And it's been increasing 3% per year by volume over 10 years. Now, Europe has accounted for 30% of the global exports. Most of it's from Spain, as I mentioned, and it's traded within the EU. Brazil is by far the largest southern hemisphere supplier, and it exports most of its produce to Europe and a few other countries around their region. In Central America, which is the second largest region of production, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, as I mentioned, are the big suppliers, and most of their exports go to the United States. In the Middle East, Iran and Turkey and Jordan are big exporters, and again, a lot to their region or north into Russia. Asia, for the massive production that they have, as I say, China with its 70 odd million tonnes, it's the world's by far and away the biggest producer of melons. Most of it's consumed in the countries and in the regions. Yes, there's some trade across from the border from Vietnam into China and vice versa, but a lot of the Asian production stays within that Asian area. I can see it on a map, and again, for those not able to see the map, just bear in mind, think of a map of the world. Australia, we're down the bottom, and we've exported 10,000 tonnes of melons into Asia, 8,000 tonnes into the Middle East, and 6,000 tonnes into New Zealand. The distances that we're sending melons is actually further than almost anyone else in the world, because most of the trade in melons, because of the value of melons, it's all going by sea, and a lot of it goes by truck, and it's going across a border. So you've got 1 million tonnes of trade, for example, all within the Asian region, from China across into countries in Southeast Asia and so forth. You've got also 1 million tonnes or more of trade happening from the Middle East, going up into Russia or across into Europe. You've got 2.5 million tonnes is just circulating within Europe only. And you've got about 400,000 tonnes going from Brazil up into Europe. So they're the big movements, but nothing's really travelling as far as what they are from Australia up to, for example, the Middle East. They're long distances. That's just, again, a broad view of the trade for melons. We need to take a little bit into context of what's happening in that Asian area where we're exporting fruit generally to, but also our melons. And I'd like to just digress for a moment and just mention that the trade in Asia, particularly China, is moving from being traditional wet markets to modern cashless online hybrid stores. And by that I mean people can ring up or go online, order their fruit, go down to the store and pick it up, or they could go into the store, they could actually select their fruit and then have it delivered to their home within 30 minutes. These are the sort of things that are happening across the Asian markets now. And when you think about how people shop in Asia, they're not going down to a big supermarket like we do in Australia with a car and load up the car with all our groceries. They have to carry everything home to small apartments. So regular home deliveries is quite common and growing quite rapidly in those markets. And you've got to consider then, when we're selling melons into those markets, whether they can be taken home in whole, or has it been cut as we see here. But all these sort of things need to be considered as to how the consumers are using the fruit for their consumption. A couple of thoughts though in terms of melons. As I say, 80 million tonnes or more of melons circulating within the China market can be very, very low value, and people buy them, take them home, cut them up, as you know, for quite low value. On the contrary, you've probably seen pictures of melons in Japan. The square melons can then sell for upwards of $150 per piece in the upper end Japanese stores. So vast range of marketing for different types of melons. Where we've come now, we've looked at the global trade in fresh fruit and the drivers. We've looked at the melons and what's driving melons. And the big difference in melons is a lot more melons are actually consumed within the markets where they're being grown. Now we're going to have a look at the Australian trade statistics. Melon production in Australia has increased from about 160,000 tonnes to about 260,000 tonnes over the last 20 years, with some peaks and troughs, but certainly we're at an area that we're in the highest volume of production we've ever seen on record. In terms of trade, firstly, Australian fresh fruit exports, as you may have read, has reached $1.5 billion in 2019. Total fruit, that is. That's an increase from around $350 million in 2011. So in this last decade, it's increased from 350 to $1.5 billion. And there's a lot of things that are driving that. In the decade of the noughties, from 2000 to 2010, we had severe drought. We had a very high escalating US dollar. We had the GFC in 2009, but the drought and the high domestic prices kept exports low. Since 2011, though, we've had a raft of free trade agreements, the Japan, Korea, China, ASEAN, of course, and that, together with new market access for a number of products across the fruit range and increased capability of our exporters and more competition, which has actually driven us to become more export focused, has driven that tremendous growth we've seen since 2011. But 80% of that is in two products or two product categories, and that's grapes and it's citrus. That is followed by summer fruit and cherries. Melons is the fifth largest by value, and in fact about the third or fourth largest by volume, depending upon where summer fruit sits in, both sitting in around 24,000 tonnes. Melons are a very important part of the Australian fruit export landscape, being one of the key export products. Australian melons exports increased 20% in 2019 to 24,000 tonnes, valued at $42 million. Now that's still less than 10% of total production, but it is a significant growth, and Queensland is the largest state. Queensland accounted for about 60% of all exports, followed by Western Australia, which has had a very strong growth. And Western Australia is now accounting for about 17 or 18% share of the total exports of 4,200 tonnes. But they increased 88% in 1 year. By month, the largest time for exports of melons is October to January, and that's when most of the fruit is coming out of Queensland, but there are melon exports all year round. From January to April, the biggest state exporter is now Western Australia, and that's had, as I say, quite significant growth. There are small volumes of exports from other states, but sometimes that can be just related to movement of fruit between the main growing areas and the export areas, companies in maybe Victoria or New South Wales. In many cases, the figures should be showing the exports from the state of origin. The exports by month by type, even though there's more watermelons produced globally and more watermelons produced in Australia, the rock melons, musk melons group is by far the largest export by type. So every month of the year there are more rock melons exported than there are watermelons. If we look at the melons by type, rock melons, and I'll use the term rock melons, I'm sorry for purists, because rock melons, musk melons, all other melons, 15,834 tonnes, compared to watermelons, which are 8,177 tonnes. So almost twice as many rock melons compared to watermelons, which is quite different to the overall production. Rock melon exports mostly to Singapore, the Middle East, New Zealand and Japan and Hong Kong. And Japan I'll speak about in a moment, but that has increased rapidly. The 8,000 tonnes of watermelons has gone nearly 2/3 to the Middle East and most of the rest to New Zealand and a tiny bit to all other, including Japan. Now, those key export markets, when we consider, one thing is to export a certain volume and say, oh, this market's larger than that. we really need to look in context of what we're competing and who we're competing against. Singapore is the largest single market for rock melons. Well, when we go to Singapore, our volume is competing with trade from other areas, with 3 or 4 other competitors, and we're about a third of the imports going into Singapore, whereas in New Zealand we are 100%. There's no other competitor. In the United Arab Emirates, which is the largest player in the Middle East, we're about 5%. So although it's a significant market in its own right, or for us, we're a very small player because we're up against other Middle East and European suppliers going into the Middle East market. Likewise in Japan, we are competing with Mexico and Honduras and the United States, and we're about 10%. But that's significant because we only got access a few years ago. So to get to that is a good result for Japan. Watermelon exports, again, New Zealand, it's a small amount of trade, and again, no competition. We're the only one that has supplied New Zealand. We supplied the same volume to the UAE, and that was about 3% of their total imports, because they're importing a huge amount from Iran, from India, from Jordan and from Egypt. In Japan, once again, we were the only supplier, but it was only about 66 tonnes into Japan. The total watermelon exports, as I say, to the Middle East was 5,000 tonnes, and to New Zealand was 2,800 tonnes, and the watermelon exports were valued in total $14.5 million, with an average unit price of about $1.77, which interestingly was up 20% on the year before. So you're actually getting better returns, and those strong returns are certainly coming in from those Middle East markets that are paying even more than New Zealand. The rock melon and other melon results, 15,800 tonnes worth 28 million, with an average unit value of $1.78. Again, up about 7%. Some of that is to do with a favourable exchange rate. The biggest growth markets, surprisingly, is Singapore. That's our number one market, and it was also up 27%. But Japan was 2,200 tonnes, up 176%. That's a really good result, and we're starting to make an impact in Japan since we gained access about 4 years ago. The Middle East, much lower than Singapore. It's about 2,500 tonnes, and it's actually down about 6%. But as I said in the previously, what we send into the Middle East is competing with Iran and Jordan and Egypt and lots of and other suppliers. In terms of our growth, 10 years ago, we were exporting about 8,000 tonnes. This year, 24,000 tonnes. And it's been a steady increase ever since. There was a small blip in 2018, and that, as you well know, was due to the health scares that you had. But it wasn't a huge setback, and we're certainly back on track with strong growth. I've got some figures here if you're interested to look at the table in more detail, but it's showing over the 10 years where the big growth markets have been, and it's definitely coming in as strong growth in the Middle East, strong growth in Singapore, Japan coming from nowhere to 2,000 tonnes in 4 years, and New Zealand, which has been 4% growth per year, which is, we're the only ones in there, so we're it for New Zealand. Interestingly, you won't see a lot of the Asian markets on our list because we either don't have access or there's limited demand for the reasons that I spoke about earlier in this presentation. Interesting, we are able to have our strong position in Singapore because they don't grow any fruit there, and the Middle East are big consumers of melons. So in summing up, I know I've had a lot of figures today, but to give you a perspective is, yes, we are a small player, but if we are a small player and we understand what's driving the global trade in not only melons, but total fresh fruit trade, we're better positioned to know where we are able to grow our own trade and be realistic. Fresh fruit is definitely growing faster than any other fresh fruit in terms of trade. More perishable, of course, and that has its own implications, but we're getting on top of a lot of those in the global sense. 7% of melons are globally traded. That's not a huge amount, but it does put in perspective most melons are consumed within the market they're grown in. And while China is by far the largest producer, Spain and Mexico are very large exporters, and we can see where their trade is going. There are geographic, geopolitical, socio-economic trends that are driving the overall demand. We're a small player in the southern temperate zone, but the big socio-economic markets with strong growth and strong demand are in the northern temperate zones, North America, Europe and Asia, as I mentioned, 44% of the global population. So with all that, I could go on and talk a lot more about what these drivers are, but consumers are wanting high quality fresh produce. The retailers know high quality fresh produce drives traffic into their store, and the more markets that are modernising with good retail, strong demand for high quality fruit are the markets that are driving a lot of this fresh produce demand for year round, particularly when trade might be light on in certain areas and we've got more supply in the southern hemisphere. So we need to understand and balance what we're able to supply with where the demand's coming from and who our competitors are. I've talked about the competitors, and the competitors being in Central America and throughout Southeast Asia and China. So we've got to understand what they're doing and how we can compete in a small area there. So overall, I appreciate being able to look at the melon market with you. I hope you've got a better understanding of where we sit in the global melon market. There are certainly growth opportunities for us. We're a small player, but finding the right niche areas, we can be in there and we can be part of this massive global market. Thank you.